So SRAM has finally done it. So this is the new 13-speed Red XPLR gravel group set. So the new Red Road group set just made its debut a couple of months ago, and unsurprisingly, they're following up with this new gravel group. So they've taken everything from their recently released Road group set and taken things up a notch with a brand new direct mount UDH rear derailleur, which isn't just more durable, but also allows for this 13-speed drivetrain with a brand new cassette that offers more range than before. And there's basically three big things that distinguish this new Explorer group from their new Red Road group. So that's going to be the 13-speed cassette, the direct mount rear derailleur, as well as wider cranks that match up with the chain line that's needed for this group. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of advantages to that additional gear, namely more range, where you could have a more capable gear for climbing if you decide to keep the same chainring size up front, or you could increase your chainring size up front for a bit more top end. So I've been riding the new Red Explorer group for the last few weeks, and in this video, I want to go over how it compares to the new Red Road group, what kind of options you have in terms of like chainring sizes and crank lengths and stuff like that, the setup processes and how complicated that is, and of course the ride feel and if it's worth it. And if you do happen to find the information in this video useful, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button down below. Okay, so let's go ahead and first talk about the two major components that make this group set what it is, the new 13-speed cassette as well as the new direct mount rear derailleur. So for the cassette, well, there's actually only one cassette option with a 10 to 46 tooth configuration versus the 10 to 44 range of the previous version. Now, what's interesting about this though is that the distance from cog to cog is actually exactly the same as their 12-speed cassette. So how did they add another cog? Well, it all has to do with the fact that the extra cog actually sits a bit more inboard than their other cassettes. And the reason that they can do this is because of the natural dish of the wheel where the spokes actually get narrower as it gets to the rim. So they have extra space for that extra cog to kind of hang over. Now, the gearing is kind of interesting here as well, where it's not just like they tacked on a larger cog. The two differences here is that they increased the size of the larger cog, but then added a 12-tooth cog in between. So kind of an interesting choice here where they didn't necessarily spread things out through the entire range. Now, the jump from 44 to 46 is certainly nice to have on the climbing end of things, and I didn't really find that bigger jump from the 38-tooth to be all that drastic in terms of cadence or anything like that. But we now do also have that new 12-tooth option to keep a more ideal cadence at higher speeds. The advantages of that 46-tooth cog are pretty clear on the climbing end of things, but if you don't necessarily need that additional climbing capability, you could potentially increase your chainring size up front for a little bit more on the top end. So like for me on my other gravel bike, so I'm running Force Explorer on that bike with a 40-tooth up front and a 1044 on the rear, and it works for like 99% of the riding that I do around here in Boulder County, but there are a handful of climbs, like let's say the Lickskilla Road climb that goes at the Gold Hill General Store, and if you've ridden that climb, you know that's pretty steep, but on that climb, I could definitely use another gear from time to time, but I actually tend to spin out the 40-10 combination a bit more than when I actually want an additional climbing gear. So although the test group that I've been running is running a 40-tooth right now, I'll be switching this out to a 42-tooth and seeing how that all works out. But for those of you who've been contemplating doing a mullet drivetrain where you have Explorer in the front and then one of SRAM's mountain groups in the rear, but thought that gear-to-gear jump may be just a little bit too broad for your taste when it comes to cadence, this could fit the bill as long as you didn't necessarily need that 50 or 52 tooth, of course. One thing I do have to say really quick about this cassette though before we move on to the rear derailleur is that just from a pure engineering and like tech geek standpoint, this is kind of a piece of art for how they shaped it along with the rivets holding it all together. I'd actually love like a schematic of something like this on my wall or something like that, just kind of like as art. Oh, and then one more thing is that this uses the same XDR interface as their other cassettes, so there's not any special free hub bodies or anything like that that you'll need. The other part that makes this 13-speed setup work is this new direct mount rear derailleur, and the first thing that you may notice is that this thing is massive. Like, I was really taken aback how large this was when I first took it out of the box. It does weigh a little bit more than the previous generation, where I think this adds around 80 grams or so, but there is also a massive increase in durability with its direct mount interface with the compatible UDH frame. So you definitely don't have to worry about bent hangers or anything like that, and traveling with something like this should cause a lot less worries as well. And then if something were to happen, this whole thing is rebuildable. Now you may be asking why they didn't bring out 13 speeds with their new Red Road group set, and apparently they couldn't pull off the range with a traditional hanger where they actually needed this UDH interface to make this work while still keeping the same cog to cog distance. Now, although they are pulling in a lot of technology from the transmission mountain drivetrains like the direct mount interface along with the UDH frame and even the magic pulley on the bottom, this is technically not transmission. This is just a full mount rear derailleur on a UDH frame. And for how it differs, first of all, it uses a flat top road chain. So it doesn't use their transmission flat top chain. And the reason for this is that the cassette teeth profile actually differs a little bit. So with transmission, they prioritize shifting under load versus this, which prioritizes shift speed. And there's also a little bit lighter spring on the rear derailleur, which is a little bit more appropriate for gravel versus transmission, which is more appropriate for mountain. And the shift speed is really, really fast, as you can imagine, but I didn't necessarily even have a problem with shifting under load either. Like, I was cranking on this thing and still shifting away, and it was totally fine. Now, one interesting thing to note about this rear derailleur is that if you look from the back, the pulley wheels are actually a little bit offset, and it actually looks like the derailleur cage is bent. That's actually what it's supposed to be like, and that's a portion of how this all works apparently. The rear derailleur also does have a clutch, so that's going to help prevent thrown chains, and again, I had zero issues there as well. And it also does have a little cage lock mechanism, which makes it easier to get the wheel in and out. So I mentioned the chain a second ago, as well as the fact that the cog-to-cog distance is actually the same as their other groups. And what's interesting is that this is the same exact red road chain that they just came out with, where I think it's like 13 grams lighter than the previous generation. But what's interesting is that you can actually use any other SRAM flat top road chain with this from their other road or gravel group sets because of that same cog-to-cog distance. And this is the part where I really have to commend SRAM on, where there's actually a lot of shared components with not only their new red road group set, but other Explorer group sets as well. But the last piece that distinguishes the Explorer group set from their red road group set are the cranks. And specifically, I'm actually talking about the spindle. So the crank arms themselves, so those are the same carbon lightweight crank arms, but the spindle is actually wider on these to match up with the chain line. So these are, let's see, 47.5 millimeters wide with 150 millimeter Q factor versus the road versions, which are 45 millimeters wide and have a Q factor of 145 millimeters. And the cranks are available in a ton of lengths from 160 millimeters all the way up to 175 millimeters. And then for chain rings, those go up from 38 all the way up to 46. There is also a power meter option available with these cranks, and I'll get into power accuracy here in just one bit, but if you don't get the power meter option, the chain rings are going to be a direct mount chainring directly to the cranks themselves, and then the power meter is a power meter spider that actually uses a new thread mount chainring interface, which is different than their road group and does also require a special SRAM thread mount chainring removal tool. But the direct mount chainring interface on the crank arms themselves is actually the same as their road group. So you can go ahead and still use those Aero power meter chainring setups that they have. It's just that with these cranks, these are going to be wider. But as you probably noticed, this is a dedicated 1x setup. There is no double option. You can choose different crank lengths or different chainring sizes, as well as power meter or no power meter, but it is 1x. And I guess this all has to do with the rear derailleur, where the parallelogram, as well as the path of the mech, it only works with one chainring. Now, when it comes to the levers, so these are the same levers as their new red road group set, and you probably have heard a lot of hype about these, and I'm here to tell you that the hype is pretty real. The shape of these levers is pretty darn comfortable and pretty great for the most part, where they have a ton of room up top and you have a lot of options when it comes to the ideal riding position. Now, since these are a little bit longer, the reach actually may be a little bit different than what you may used to, especially at the front of the hood. So it actually is something to consider when it comes to stem length, where when I was at the front of the hoods, I definitely felt a lot longer than usual. But I do quite like that a lot, where when I'm on the tops, it's pretty darn comfortable in a more upright position. And then I have a lot of options when it comes to the hoods themselves. And then when I place my hands on the front of the hoods, I can get a little bit more aero without necessarily having to go into the drops. The other portion that's changed considerably versus the previous generation are these levers, where these are a lot longer, and again, the hype is real, where the shape is really nice. There's lots of different positions for your fingers, and they actually do offer that true one finger braking that SRAM advertises. Like, I can brake from the uppermost portion of the lever right here where there's the least leverage and come to a stop very quickly without much effort at all. And then the levers also flare out a pretty good amount as well from the hood, so these should match up pretty well with most flared gravel bars, and they do of course match up pretty well with their new Zip SL70 XPLR gravel bars that are also being announced alongside with this new group, where they not only match the flare but also on the hoods, where it makes a nice smooth transition from the bar to the hood. And then one more advantage to this whole reconfigured setup right here with these longer hoods is that you can actually kind of grab onto these hoods right here, kind of like they're extensions to your bars. And then they also have the bonus buttons on the top, where you can use these as alternative places to shift in either direction, or you can map these buttons to ANT+ functions like controlling your bike computer, so you can use them to change your data pages, you can pause and resume your ride, or you can even use the bell function on the Crew 3 as well as the Garmin Edge 1050. But this is one of the few complaints I do have about this group, are the position of the bonus buttons, where it's kind of unnatural, where I actually have to move my thumbs up and then kind of press them, where I think it could be a lot more natural if they were lower. And it's not necessarily like easy to push these buttons. It does take a little bit of force, so I think positioning them lower, it still wouldn't necessarily result in accidental presses. And then going back to the brakes really quick, so again, these are going to be the same as the new Red road group set, so these will have the same amount of power that you get with those, which is plenty by the way, but the combination of the levers and the brakes do allow for the immediate stopping power when you need it, but they also offer a good amount of modulation. And that's really the thing with brakes, is that they need to offer that nice balance of the stopping power when you really want it, along with the ability to feather the brakes without any jerkiness, like if you're in a group or something, and these do offer that nice balance. Oh, and then when it comes to power accuracy, it's looking pretty good out of these so far, so here's a ride compared to a Tacx Neo 3M, as well as a pair of Vivero Asiomas, and those numbers line up pretty darn well. I would have probably expected the Quark to read somewhere kind of in between the Neo 3M and the Asiomas just due to where they are on the drivetrain, but these numbers are kind of hard to complain about. And you may notice a handful of dropouts on this data set right here, but I was running a ton of sensors on this workout, so I'm not sure if there's just some interference or something like that going on with this particular workout. Okay, so last thing, let's talk about setup. So I have this installed on a new Cervelo Aspero frame, and all in all, this whole bike comes in right around 17 pounds without the pedals. Now, for the setup process, there's a lot of convenient things here since it's electronic, such as the fact that you don't have to route derailleur cables or derailleur housing, but you will of course need to route the brake lines. The most unique portion of this setup, which may differ a lot from other frames, is this whole UDH interface, where you do have to be pretty specific with the rear derailleur as well as the chain. Now, this is the first UDH bike that I'm actually setting up myself, just for some reference, and although these steps, well, there's only 3 of them really, you do have to get those just right. When it comes to the chain, you won't be putting on the largest cog and like stretching it out like you would on a traditional bike, but you'll actually use a chain length calculator, and that's going to be based on your chain length. But once your chain is measured and cut, now you can actually install the components, and it's kind of this interesting dance of like tightening, then loosening, then tightening again. So you'll install the rear derailleur using the UDH interface, where you'll tighten that all the way down, but then you'll loosen that just a little bit. Then you'll install the through axle on the other end, tighten that all the way down, but then you'll loosen it just a little bit. But once everything's installed, but actually a little bit loose, you'll pull back on the rear derailleur when it's in its setup position to get the right amount of chain like tautness, I guess you could say, or chain tension. And then you'll actually crank everything down. Again, it was kind of this interesting little dance of like tightening, then loosening, then tightening again. But again, this was the first time I set up a UDH bike on my own, so it was a bit different. Now, one thing to note though is that if you do choose to change your chain ring size, you will need to go through that whole process of recalculating your chain length, since there's going to be a different chain ring size, and going through that kind of like tightening, loosening, tightening process of the UDH hanger side again. So it's really kind of hard not to like what SRAM has done here, but it does come at a cost, of course, but it really isn't all that much different than their new Road Red group set. But I think what is kind of interesting are all those upgrade paths, since it does have a lot of shared components, where if you have another Explorer group set, all you have to do is get a cassette, a rear derailleur, as well as a chain, again, as long as you have a UDH frame. And then if you have one of their new Red road group set, you need to get the cranks as well, which are going to be wider. Anyhow, that's the new 13-speed Red XPLR group set. And if you have any questions about it that I didn't cover in this video, feel free to drop those down in the comment section down below, and also make sure to subscribe to the channel for plenty more bike related videos just like this that are coming soon. In the meantime, happy riding, and we will see you in the next video.